It is not a secret that Reform UK leader Nigel Farage is a big fan of the United States. He certainly spends far more time there than he does his elected constituency of Clacton. And he was stateside again yesterday to give testimony to the House Judiciary Committee, having been invited by the Republican Party. He was asked his opinions about the state of free speech in the UK, and this is what he had to say.
You can say what you like, I don't care, because that's what free speech is. And in a sense, this has all been going wrong now for a couple of decades. We've kind of forgotten the Voltairean principles that we'll fight and defend to the death your right to say something that we fundamentally disagree with. That is the absolute foundation, if you think about it, of free speech, of democracy, of living in freedom. It's kind of why we fought 2 world wars at massive, massive cost to defend that very principle for ourselves and for many, many others around the country. And I first became worried about all this with cancel culture. You know, the idea that we can't have this speaker go to a university because some people might be offended by what he or she have to say. It is important to note that there is not a parent in the United Kingdom, and I would guess it's the same for America too, that is not concerned about content their children as minors can find on the internet. Not a single parent that is not concerned about this. But at the moment, we're not finding the right solutions. I do myself begin to think that hardware might be one of the solutions, that laptops, that handsets could be programmed so that many, many apps and many, many services simply aren't available from these devices. But what we've done is to go down the legislative route. And it's extraordinary that, you know, I come from the land of Magna Carta, I come from the land that gave us the mother of parliaments, and it doesn't give me any great joy to be sitting in America and describing the really awful authoritarian situation that we have now sunk into.
Now, when it comes to the Online Safety Act, I'd have at least some level of agreement with Reform UK. I think Zia Yusuf's opinions he had on Newsnight talking about how it's very easy to circumvent with VPNs were very prescient. And with regards to the chilling effect it has on the spread of information, of course, the people who would get legislatively affected by the Online Safety Act are the platforms themselves, who I don't really have much truck with. When it comes to the stifling of information being spread because of the ways in which that you have to essentially give up your information to private companies to be able to access it, it's this structure broadly that I have a problem with. Although part of the free speech debate, we can have that discussion. But if you to say, well, I was first worried about free speech when it comes to cancel culture, let's be very, very clear. Free speech is about the acts of governments to be able to remove people's freedoms because of the things that they do and say, right? It's not about what are essentially the customers, the clients, the paying clients of universities not wanting to have their money that they've paid for their degrees being spent on people who that they believe have views that they find completely reprehensible. Just because a private institution has disinvited another private person, this is not in any way a representation of free speech law as it comes down from a government. Again, you can agree or disagree all you want. I'm willing to hear that discussion. But actual free speech is about government legislation. And individual universities cancelling people, quote unquote, that's nothing to do with the state. Now, he also compared the UK to North Korea over how the police respond to posts on social media.
And we, of course, have the extraordinary events that we understood yesterday of Graham Linehan, the comedic writer, and he put out some tweets months ago when he was in Arizona, and months later he arrives at Heathrow Airport to be met by 5 armed police. Armed police, not a big deal in the USA, a very big deal in the United Kingdom. 5 of them. And he was arrested and taken away for questioning. He's not even a British citizen. He's an Irish citizen. This could happen to any American man or woman that goes to Heathrow that has said things online that the British government and British police don't like. It is a potentially big threat to tech bosses, to many, many others. This legislation we've got will damage trade between our countries, threaten free speech across the West because of the knock-on rollout effects of this legislation from us or from the European Union. So I've come today as well to be a klaxon, to say to you, don't allow, piece by piece, this to happen here in America. And you would be doing us and yourselves and all freedom-loving people a favor if your politicians and your businesses said to the British government, you've simply got this wrong. At what point did we become North Korea? Well, I think the Irish comedy writer found that out 2 days ago at Heathrow Airport.
Now, it seems to me a ridiculous comparison given the state of what North Korea does, right? But fundamentally, especially when you're looking at the Graham Linehan case here, like, sure, we can all have the discussion about people turning up, 5 police officers who are armed, and they're armed in an airport. We don't need 5 police officers to question somebody over an investigation you have into potential incitement to violence. But that's what this was. Right? They were investigating potential incitement to violence. I believe the charges have been dropped. And that's not the same as North Korea locking people up for things they don't like. It is indeed not the same as the US government who were literally locking people up for things that they didn't like, right? Incitement to violence is not the same as voicing opinions that disagree with US foreign policy, which is Marco Rubio's point. People like Mahmoud Khalil and people like Remesa Ozturk were called out specifically by Marco Rubio as saying things that were not in the interest of US foreign policy. Now, that is an explicit violation of free speech because you're literally disagreeing with the policies of the government of the day and them using law enforcement, in this case was ICE, as a way of which removing your freedoms. That is an explicit free speech violation. So for Nigel Farage to go and say that an investigation by the police, which didn't actually come to anything in the end, is somehow not as bad or somewhere worse than the reality that in the United States right now, at time of recording, they're still happy to clamp down on people's free speech just for disagreeing with American foreign policy is so unbelievably hypocritical. Unbelievably hypocritical. Now, it's the comparison with North Korea that's caused the biggest uproar. A pretty asinine comparison, as if there's anything analogous between laws restricting incitement of violence and the kind of totalitarian human rights violations that the DPRK repeatedly engages in. Although it was the disloyalty to the nation that riled up plenty of the UK commentariat. Here's LBC's Iain Dale with an uncharacteristically direct takedown of Farage.
An absolute disgrace. And I don't say that lightly. It is unprecedented for a leader of a UK political party to go to another country and slag off his own country. And that's what he was doing in the most disgraceful way. I have concerns about some aspects of freedom of speech in this country, but I wouldn't go to a foreign committee to express them. Of course, what he omitted to say was that America has this same issue. In fact, it's far worse in America. Free speech is protected under Section 2 of the American Constitution. And yet, the American government, led by Donald Trump, now forces anybody who goes to America to say what their social media feeds are. And when your application for a visa is considered, the American embassy in the relevant country goes through your social media feed to see if you are an appropriate person to be allowed into the country. Now, that is a restriction of British freedom of speech. I'm obviously flabbergasted that Nigel Farage didn't mention that in front of this committee. But to go abroad and say these things, particularly on a day when he should have been in the British Parliament scrutinising the government and asking a question in Prime Minister's questions, I think it is an outrage. He was effectively almost urging the American government to impose worse trading relations with the UK if we didn't get our act together on free speech. I mean, if that isn't traitorous, I don't know what is.
It's really incredible that somebody who professes to be a British patriot can go to another country and imply that they should use trade war or diplomacy and trade, as he described it, try and get us to change the position of the elected government of the day. Parliamentary sovereignty was his point for Brexit. We can have that discussion as well. But for parliamentary sovereignty to, he say, should be undermined, the democratic will of our people for the government that we've elected, well, I guess I didn't elect it, but we've elected it, to get them to change their policy with international trade. This is a man, quite frankly, who wants us to be, in my opinion, a vassal state of the United States of America. That's what the Brexit paradigm was. It wasn't about actual sovereignty. It wasn't about, indeed, what it could have been, which was to have an independent economic policy that is about industrial policy and wanting to empower British workers against international capital. No, that's not what it was. It was a way of separating us from people who have kind of similar opinions upon the European continent and forcing us to be reliant on our Atlanticist relationship with the United States. And this just shows just how far Nigel Farage will go to cock us out to the American empire and to American unipolarity, so much so that he will goad, in my opinion, the United States government to want to give us less favorable economic relationships to try and get our government, our elected government, to change policy. Again, for the first time in my life, I agree with Iain Dale. It is 100%, in my opinion, traitorous behaviour. Traitorous behaviour, 100%. Again, from a professed British patriot. What a hypocrite. Now, it wasn't just people this side of the pond who had strong words for Mr. Farage. Despite a favourable congressional invite to talk about the issue, he was also expected to face scrutiny from Democratic members. Here's how Maryland's 8th Representative Jamie Raskin responded to Farage's comments.
Protectors of free speech, but they only want to protect speech they agree with. In the UK, Mr. Farage is openly promoting the abolition of the Human Rights Act of 1998 to be replaced with a British Bill of Rights that limits the right of free speech to British citizens and legally sanctioned residents. He complains that racist threats against immigrants are not protected free speech, while he proposes to strip migrants, tourists, and perhaps even visiting American congresspeople of any free speech rights at all. I had my own close encounter with that when Mr. Farage and his team presented for more than an hour in a conversation we had about free speech. And after 3 minutes of talking, he cut me off and terminated the meeting because he didn't like what I was saying. That's the kind of free speech he's committed to. There is a free speech crisis in America today, but there's no free speech crisis in Britain. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer has not shut down GB News, where Mr. Farage has his own show, just because Mr. Farage has used his airtime to call for banning peaceful protests that he disagrees with. No one has stopped him from going on Russian TV 17 times and saying also and repeating that the one world political leader he most admired was Vladimir Putin, even though Vladimir Putin is a war criminal and a dictator who has regularly interfered in other countries' democratic elections. No one has stopped Mr. Farage from parroting Putin's absurd talking points, like when Farage claimed that NATO, the US, and Britain provoked this war in Ukraine. For a man who fashions himself as some kind of a free speech martyr, Mr. Farage seems most at home with the autocrats and dictators of the world who are crushing freedom on earth. Mr. Farage wants to get rid of the Online Safety Act in his country, a law shepherded by the Conservative Party and implemented by the Labour Party, which bans child pornography online, protects children from harmful content, forbids non-consensual pornography and other unlawful content. He should go and advance the positions he's taking here in Congress today in Parliament, which is meeting today, if he's serious about it. To the people of UK who think this Putin-loving free speech imposter and Trump sycophant will protect freedom in your country, come on over to America and see what Trump and MAGA are doing to destroy our freedom, kidnap college students off the street, ban books from our libraries, militarize our police and unleash them against our communities, take over our universities, wreck our professional civil service, and turn the government into a money-making machine for Trump and his family. You might think twice before you let Mr. Farage make Britain great again. I yield back.
You might want to twink twice? I should be so lucky. But I mean, aside from his comments on the Online Safety Act, which I've already said I agree with Reform UK on with regards to its stifling effect on speech, plenty of great points there to be made. A man who fawns after actual autocrats and dictators such as Vladimir Putin, who is wanting to remove us from the Human Rights Act, which is the ECHR enshrined in UK law, and wanting to take away a bunch of human rights from people he deems as non-citizens. Something, again, that's been imported as a cultural topic from the United States. The citizen, alien dynamic is what they use in the United States in their discussion of undocumented migration over there. And the idea, again, people who will support Nigel Farage because they want to remove themselves from these human rights acts because they think that it won't be weaponized against them when those rights are lost. I think that given what we're seeing in America, that might be something that you will live to regret in future, in my opinion. Dahlia, do you think that Nigel Farage is a traitor to Britain?
I mean, what I do know is that Nigel Farage is not going to have to live in the society that he is creating, the division, the hatred that he is sowing in this country. I mean, when you look at what we are seeing now, not just the kind of flag shagging, the rampant flag shagging, but the racist abuse, the hostility, the the violence, the presence of highly unnerving agitators in our neighborhoods, which, not only have we seen online how that is so frequently accompanied by racist abuse, but now I have got, unfortunately, quite ample personal experience of me and my friends who have been subjected to that hostility in recent weeks. Nigel Farage is not going to have to live in that society where we are fighting each other for scraps and we are, blaming our neighbours for systemic issues. He's, when you look at admittedly, the Reform Manifesto is pretty thin on the ground when it comes to anything other than making the lives of trans people and migrants worse. But what is there is ultimately like a hollowed out version of a social democratic society. We're talking about the introduction of insurance style healthcare that is in the Reform Manifesto. We're talking about things like scrapping the renters bill. We're talking about scrapping labour protections, basic labour protections. We're talking about so many different things that are going to be, and not to mention leaving the European Court of Human Rights, so many things that are going to lower our quality of life, to strip us of some of the remaining things that keep our society together. And Nigel Farage is not going to have to live in the consequences of that, because Nigel Farage, ironically, for one of the most anti-migrant politicians we have, the most anti-migrant politician we have, is one of the most mobile people I have ever, in Parliament today. He's constantly travelling. He's hardly ever in Parliament. He's constantly in front of the press. His 2 kids have German passports, which means that they still get to enjoy the fruits of European freedom of movement, whilst also all of us are being trapped on this rainy fascist island and can't leave, can't move out. He does not have to live in the consequences because of his wealth. He's the most highly paid member of Parliament because of his love of traveling around the world and the fact that he's constantly being received by places like the US. I'm sure that he would love to have, instead of having to be an MP for Clacton, would love to be able to be, whining and dining in Mar-a-Lago and just, living it up with the Trumps. But, unfortunately, he's stuck being a UK MP here. He is not living in the same world as us. And so is it traitorous? Sure. But more important than that, he is not staked in the society that we live in the way that we are. And for him, sprinkling and agitating this kind of hatred and hostility and paving the way for us to lose materially the very small amounts of things that we have, such as a public NHS, the introduction of the renters bill, the European Court of Human Rights. He does not have to live with the consequences of that, because he is not living in the same society that we are living in because of his wealth and his mobility. But I think on the question of free speech as well, the deep irony, I think that interview really shows the way in which free speech has been so cynically and effectively used by the right and by the far right. He is sitting there, Nigel Farage makes a really big deal out of universities. The thing that he talks about as being, the primary threat to free speech is students on universities protesting against the invitation of particular speakers to their campus. Now, first of all, I would say that protesting a speaker is a form of free speech. A speaker is invited. If you want to protest that speaker and make your case for why we should not listen to that speaker, you are exercising your freedom of speech. He is sitting and fangirling Trump's America, where Trump is literally cutting funding to universities depending on key terms that are used in your research. So if you have in your research certain terms like trans, women, diversity, liberation, certain terms in your research, you will not get funding from the US state anymore. And bear in mind that the government is a key funder of research. So the way that they have flipped free speech on their head and demonized actual freedom of speech and actual public debate, and use that as a smokescreen to enforce state crackdowns on particular kind of research and speech. I am flabbergasted that the ruse has been able to be kept up this long, because no one is more of an enemy of free speech than the wannabe tin pot authoritarians like Donald Trump, like Nigel Farage, like Putin, who, Farage and Trump are very enamored by. There's some kind of weird, sublimed desire happening there. But no one is more of an enemy of free speech than these wannabe tin pot authoritarians. And I'm glad that someone was able to call that out. I wish that the press in our country, rather than contributing to this moral panic around free speech on universities, was able to actually interrogate the promoters of that moral panic on their own terms a little bit more. Maybe we wouldn't be in this situation right now where Nigel Farage is being essentially rammed down our throats as the next Prime Minister.
Yeah, I totally agree. There, it is interesting again how when they were crying about free speech, it was all my Twitter account has been shut down because I violated the terms of service. And yet radio silence when it comes to stuff like the proscription of Palestine action and the arrest of elderly ladies protesting genocide.